Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets US President Donald Trump for the first time on Monday in Washington, D.C., healthy defense ties between the two countries are expected to buoy the discussions. Key issues that will be discussed include operationalizing India's unique status as a major defense partner of America, the proposed $2 billion sale of Guardian remotely piloted vehicles to India, and negotiation of a security agreement that would allow the US to import sensitive communications equipment to India. Meanwhile, on Sunday, from the goods and services tax to the surgical strikes conducted by the Indian Army last year, Prime Minister Narendra Modi trotted out what he saw as his administration's achievement at his meetings with American CEOs and Indian Americans. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will take stock of the Prime Minister's ongoing visit to the United States. Joining me on the program today are Saurabh Srivastava, Chairman Emeritus NASSCOM, Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, Bharat Karnad, Research Professor, National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research, and TK Arun, Editor, Opinion, The Economic Times. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. Before we talk about the much anticipated meeting between Trump and Prime Minister Modi, let's talk about what happened on Sunday. You know, the Prime Minister met two sets of people. He met CEOs of American companies and he also met the Indian diaspora. Let's focus on the CEOs first. And what do you think were the takeaways from that?
Well, you know, this is the kind of meeting that happens every time the Prime Minister visits the US or any other major industrialized country. The intention is, of course, for him as the #1 salesman for India Inc. To showcase India as a very good investment destination. His what is referred to as completely very, very important schemes of Make in India and so on and so forth. The developments that have taken place here, you mentioned the GST. So that is basically the Prime Minister inviting the top American CEOs and I believe the top 5 control assets in their companies that are roughly equal to India's GDP to help India in its growth story. I don't see anything new in this particular meeting.
Right.
It invariably ends up in a lot of praise for the Prime Minister's presentation from the the industrialists and the CEOs present there. There's always a wish list from them which haven't changed over the years, frankly, about market access and labor laws and opening up of various sectors of the economy and the ease of doing business and so on. So there's a feel-good kind of result that comes out of these meetings.
But
they are very useful. I'm not saying that. They are very useful, and the fact that they happen in every visit is not a criticism, because this kind of interaction between the Prime Minister, who actually is a hands-on policymaker in India more than most, is a very important thing. What I'm saying is that I do not see anything completely new that has come out of this, or some major policy change or anything like that. As far as it goes, I would say it was a very useful exercise, but not something that would, immediately result in substantive, visible gains on the ground.
Sure. Mr. Srivastava, I'd like to bring you in. Of course, Ambassador Mukherjee touched upon ease of doing business. That continues to remain a problem as far as foreign investment in India is concerned, isn't it?
Well, let me also address what Ambassador Mukherjee said. I think he's right. These meetings do happen routinely. But this is not a routine time. You look at who the Prime Minister met. He met the heads of the top technology companies in the world. Most of the people he met had something to do with technology. India is now, in 2 ways, the most important country for all these companies. A, as a market. For many of them, we are either the 2nd or 3rd largest market. For most of them, we are the single largest source of qualified and innovative and experienced technology people So there's a very strong connect. Within the next 7 years, the digital part of India's economy would cross $1 trillion or more. So, to my mind, should have been, and perhaps was, more than a routine meeting. We have a big stake in how we work with them. They have a big stake in how they work with us. So it's a very, very important time.
Sure.
On the ease of doing business, many things have improved. Some have yet to move. But once the roadmap is clearer, and certainly in the technology arena, we're seeing a lot of improvements that have happened, I think things would get better. The direction is clear. Many of the policy frameworks are clear. In the technology arena, the ease of doing business, leave alone India. In fact, the US with its H-1B visas is creating problems in ease of doing business in the US. There's a bit of America first, India first. That's going to happen. But there is too high an interdependency in going forward, particularly in the technology arena.
Right. That's a very valid point that you're making. India and the United States need each other as far as technology is concerned. Professor Karnad, you know, the CEO seemed very upbeat after this meeting with Prime Minister Modi. But do you really think that it's going to translate into something substantial?
Well, as I jokingly said earlier, you see, I think they can't afford not to be upbeat and enthusiastic. After all, they're meeting with the Prime Minister, and he's on to, after the vibrant Gujarat, is now the vibrant India shtick. So that's very natural. But what are the outcomes? In the last 3 years, for instance, there has been an inflow FDI of about 9.3 billion or something like that. What was the promised thing that all these CEOs talked about 3 years back? It would amount to, I mean, rough rule of thumb kind of thing, if I recall, in excess of 70 billion. So, you know, I mean, that's the fall off. Look, the CEOs are in the business of making money. And if you do not have the milieu which is conducive to making money, to generating profits, and generally to working effectively, then they'll not come here no matter what, who meets them where and says what by way of rhetoric. So I'm afraid that these things are good, these sorts of meetings, but these are not followed up with things on the ground, which is what matters. And that's the metric I imagine the CEOs use to interact with India in terms of investing in India. And when they see that very little is actually happening, there are still the bottlenecks, there's still the bureaucratism, the red tape and the rest of it, and a lot of, shall we say, commission mongering, to use a phrase, then they'll naturally be deterred from investing in India, no matter how much they would desire for reasons of profit, for reasons of establishing economies of scale and so on, for their own companies to expand in the world. So this is what I think has been the great deficit as far as India is concerned over the last 3 years during Modi's tenure. If in 3 years, and you're going into the election scene now, what you couldn't do in 3 years, would the Prime Minister realistically be able to realize in the next 2 years? I'm not so sure. Right.
TK Arun, there are several reports that have come out after this meeting between the Prime Minister and the CEOs. The CEOs have said that, Prime Minister Modi was very constructive to feedback. He took down notes, and he was very keen on ensuring that some of these ideas are actually implemented. But thus far has been really implementation of some of these big ticket ideas.
See, CEOs meet very important people in the government, starting with the Prime Minister down to secretaries and further down. They say these nice things. But when they decide to invest, they also take into account things like one Supreme Court order rendering null the thousands of crores of investment in the hospitality sector, in hotels close to state and national highways. They look at a government rule which says that sale of cattle for slaughter is henceforth banned, thereby annulling a massive industry of beef exports. India was the largest exporter of beef, basically buffalo meat, last year. So these kind of sudden disruptions to business arising from the state itself, or the fact that Cain, one oil company which has done greater benefit to the Indian economy than any other company, foreign company you can think of, by discovering oil and gas in places where the ONGC and other companies fail to discover oil and gas. They have been slapped with a huge demand for retrospective tax, which they feel and many people feel is completely unwarranted, because they were doing consolidation, not transfer of assets to somebody else. They look at all these kind of regulatory issues that come up arising from state policy, and not just at the good words and the big picture, a nice picture that is put forward by the government and officials in these forums. So, I mean, I wouldn't put too much weight by just what they said after meeting the Prime Minister. What are they expected to say after meeting the Prime Minister? But the thing is that, as Mr. Srivastava said, we are a large and growing economy, and we are a large pool of talent which the world needs wherever they are, wherever these companies are, whether they employ them in India or in the US, on H-1B visas or on L-1 visas or something else. They need to employ our talent. Now, there are concerns on intellectual property protection in this country. There are concerns on new price regulation on drugs and stents and medical equipment, all these things. So, all these will be in play. Now, where there is agreement and confluence of views will be put up for public display and announcement. Where there is conflict and differences, they will be still be working hard behind the scenes, but not for public consumption.
Sure.
So, I mean, these meetings are important, but not so important. They are not the ones that actually decide whether the money goes or not.
Let's move on then and talk about the meeting with the Indian diaspora. Ambassador, do you believe that, the Indian diaspora really has the ability to influence political decision making in the United States?
Not really. I mean, let's get real about this. But you're talking about a community that is useful in other ways. I would like to put it that way. I've served twice in Washington and I've dealt with the community, so I can say so with some experience. Number one, it is a highly respected community. The work ethic, the achievements, the level of education, the percentage of master's degrees and so on and so forth. On all those criteria, they're about the top. They are the highest earning, the per capita earnings of the Indian community, the highest in America. So on all these criteria, and they're being looked at as a very law-abiding community that are achievers and very responsible members of American society. That's the first important point. The second important point is that over the years, when the immigration sort of was at its height in the 60s and so on, from India and other countries, of course. For many years, the Indian community basically looked after itself, kept its head down, did their work, but were not politically active. Over the last few years, and I've served in the mid-80s and the mid-90s, things have changed. The number of Indians who are now active members of both parties is legion, and it grows every year. And although still most of them vote Democratic, the very large number that vote Republican, that join the Republican Party, registered members, just like it's happening in Britain with the Tories and the Labour.
Right.
To put it very simply, those who become rich tend to go Republican. But the political consciousness and their ability to organize themselves politically has visibly increased. The AHOA, the American Hotel Owners Association, which owns 40% of the hotel rooms in America, in its annual meeting invites the President of the US every time. The President of the US comes every time because of the sheer financial muscle these people represent. The same is with the American physicians of Indian origin. And they have also created associations which are like IPAC, like the Indian American Forum for Political Education. There are any number of youngsters with political science degrees and international relations degrees and so on, who are aides to key congressmen,
right,
and so on. So that is one aspect of the diaspora which is very, very encouraging. I saw on TV about comparisons between Madison Square Garden and so on. Look, that kind of thing cannot get repeated every year.
Every year, yes.
It's not even necessary to even think about it. The size of this, and I've done it more than once in Washington and other places, is about normal. You know, a few hundred community leaders who will be there, with whom the Prime Minister will interact. And this kind of a thing, this kind of interaction with the community, with the Indian community, is invariably put into the program for obvious reasons. I mean, this is a very important bridge in our relationship, the community. Finally, I'd just like to mention some other reports I read about the Indian community. One of the subjects of great importance to them is safety and security of Indian citizens in the US. I think that's overhyped. This is not a banana republic.
Sure.
Certainly, each time something like that happens, our concerns should be expressed at the highest level. They always have been. The responses have been adequate. This is a country where then we should leave it to the law and order machinery to take its course, unless we see that there is some kind of organized pogrom or something like that. And there's absolutely no evidence of that.
Right.
So that's my comments on the community.
Sure. Let's move on now to the much anticipated meeting between Trump and Prime Minister Modi later today. Professor Karnad, what do you expect to come out of this? Do you expect something concrete at all, or do you think that it's just going to be just another meeting between two heads of state?
Look, it's very hard to predict. I think the MEAs, as I'm given to understand, has prepared an entire agenda. They have left off some things, like, for instance, I heard, which may or may not be correct, that the F-16 is off the table, simply because it's an antiquated aircraft, and it makes no sense for India, considering the Pakistanis have handled it for the last 30-odd years, to buy or get into the assembly line and so on. No matter what Tatas and Lockheed Martin have signed, and they're merely not signed an agreement. People don't realize it's just a memorandum of understanding sort of a thing. It's not really an agreement or a contract. The point, I think, is that the Guardian drones that we talked about, that's the armed predator. The unarmed predator version is what we are getting. Now, why unarmed? Because the concern with the Americans is still they have not been able to rid themselves of it, of, in some sense, denying India technologies that could be used, as they fear, against Pakistan. Despite, I imagine, predator drones would be used against camps and terrorist camps and so on in ideal situations. In any case, I think the Americans want no such situation at all to arise. And they negated our proposal for armed drones. So what we're getting is a surveillance and then to a maritime domain surveillance awareness kind of a drone. This is a small thing, not in terms of money. This in excess of about $2 to $3 billion. So it's not small. But the fact that the Americans are still hung up on the lethality aspects of weapons that India buys suggests that there are limits to the kind of technologies we can access, we can reasonably hope to access. And therefore, to pitch our expectations too high might be to, in a sense, disappoint ourselves.
Sure.
I don't think that's happening. But then again, you see, there are vested interests in America, such as Lockheed Martin, who are very keen to push the F-16 and things that would benefit them. But, you know, it's not going to catch fire, as I see it, simply because there are too many negatives attending on the thing. The other particular item that was at least once on the agenda was the AP-1000, which is now dead, pretty much, because the Westinghouse reactor that we were supposed to buy as in train of the nuclear deal that we had with America and so on and so forth, the company has gone bankrupt. The Toshiba Westinghouse consortium has, gone belly up.
Right.
So there's nothing there in terms of enforcing our technology guarantees, assuming we want to buy such reactors, which would be a disaster if we bought them. So the point to make is, I think there are lots of advanced military technologies that we would love to have, but we are unlikely to get.
Okay, fair enough. Mr. Srivastava, from an economic point of view, what is it that we can expect, and what do you think will be a good deal for us to get out of this visit?
Well, I don't think it's one single silver bullet, to be honest. I mean, that silver bullet perhaps would be a good personal equation between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. Both of them are very strong leaders, strong bases at home. Both of them are very focused on their own countries, aggressively focused, you might say. So getting a good chemistry between them and an understanding that America first and Make in India are not necessarily always in conflict, I think that would be perhaps a very nice thing to have. But at an economic level, I think getting the middle ground between the levels of protectionism that different countries seek to impose. So it's just not about, I heard some of the stuff earlier, it's not just about ease of doing business in India and our companies find it hard to do business here. There is protectionism in the US as well, although in different ways. And we absolutely do need to fix the ease of doing business here, not just for American companies, but actually for local companies as well, because our economy can grow at a much higher level if we change or improve dramatically the ease of doing business. But as I said, the market economics are there for both countries to benefit from a sensible approach to it. We are one of the largest emerging markets. We're growing at a fast rate. Many of our needs are in areas that are technology related, where America has the largest number of the most innovative companies. We, in our case, are becoming a very technology-led economy, because if you look at not just the large IT companies, but what is happening on the ground, with our becoming the world's third largest and most active hub for entrepreneurial companies to emerge. All of them have very close equations with startups in the US. So there is a lot of common activity, a lot of common ground between the two countries.
Sure.
And if we find the right way, and if we find in many ways the right framework, the right architecture, where these can gel together, then I think it would have tremendous impact on both economies. Because even if you look today at companies that raise capital for growth, just 10% of the money that Indian companies raise for growth comes from capital markets in India. 90% comes from private equity and venture capital. Most of that money comes from the US. If you look at many of the Indian companies that have been successful are in technology and in other areas, a lot of their business is in the US. So if you look at most of the US technology companies today, they will tell you, whether it's Cisco or Intel or whoever, Microsoft, that their fastest growing markets are today in India.
Right.
They're not in any other part of the world. There is huge.
I'm sorry to cut you short there, Mr. Srivastava, but I'm running out of time, so I'd like to bring in the other guests as well. TK Arun, you know, a lot has been said about this visit. It's been said that it's a low-key visit compared to the last time the Prime Minister Modi went to the United States. But will contentious issues be discussed? For instance, the H-1B visas, for that matter, or for that matter, what Trump said about India during the Paris Climate Accord. Do you think that these contentious issues are going to be discussed, or they're going to be off the table?
See, while these two individuals are meeting, they are meeting not as private individuals, but as the leaders of two countries. So countries have multiple channels for interacting with each other, one another, and communicating their concerns. So typically contentious issues should be communicated through channels other than those directly between the top leaders. I am sure India will communicate not only issues of bilateral concern, such as the kind we have discussed, also larger concerns such as what the US proposed to do in the Asia Pacific. Does America first mean that they will let China rule the roost in Asia? Does it mean that Trump will live up to his earlier threats to allow the Japanese and the Koreans to choose whether they want or not, and effectively meaning that China will be the predominant power in this place? I mean, these are all things that matter a great deal to India. So I'm sure these will also be discussed gently, directly or indirectly in whatever fashion. Their policy on ISIS, what he says to the Saudi king in the Middle East has an repercussion on the next day on what these governments do in the Gulf to Qatar. And there are a lot of Indians who are living in Qatar, and we have had to make some arrangements to ensure that those Indians are able to travel back home to India safely. Now, there are multiple issues in all these things. They are the world's largest superpower with economic and military and strategic interests across the world. And we are an emerging power in this part of the world. And in this globalized world, anything that that country does in any part of the world has an implication for India and Indians in other parts of the world, including not just in India. So it is this totality of network interests that will be discussed, not just bilateral issues that matter.
Sure.
And one meeting doesn't determine anything. It is part of an ongoing process of dialogue.
But it will set the tone for what's to come.
Yeah, it can.
It can. Yeah. Ambassador, close the show for us with your quick concluding remark.
Well, I think much of your, the queries you made related to the meeting between the Prime Minister and the President, I find myself almost in complete agreement with what Mr. Srivastava said, and particularly what Mr. Arun said just now. This is Prime Minister Modi's 5th visit. But this is his first visit where he's meeting a new President of the United States who has certain, let's put it politely, certain mercurial, certain unique features about the way he operates. Just putting it very simply, keeping in mind the background, which is that we are talking about a relationship between India and probably its most important bilateral relationship, one that affects India in a regional sense and a global sense. There is absolutely no doubt that they will not be discussing specific subjects. I can guarantee you that I've attended these meetings. There will be maybe a passing mention of H-1B visas, but I don't even expect that to be the case.
Okay.
They're going to echo the title of your program, The Big Picture.
Okay, fair enough.
They're going to find a comfort level. They're going to try, and people talk about takeaways. What I'd rather like to say is, Prime Minister Modi will be thinking not of a takeaway, but what he leaves behind.
Sure.
Does he leave behind a president of the United States who has a comfortable kind of interaction with him, an understanding, a good chemistry, which augurs well for the next 2 or 3 years, and build on a relationship that is already very strong and means a lot to both countries.
Sure.
This is going to be the crux of the meeting, and if that happens as it should happen, there's enough signals from the White House to indicate that they want that meeting to go well.
Indeed.
And so on. So if that happens, that would be the best result.
Okay. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Saurabh, Srivastava, Shiv, Shankar, Mukherjee, Bharat, Karnad and TK Arun. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.